Shoot. I'm trying to do a thing here. I'm doing a thing here. I got a jacket on. I look sophisticated. I got wine, fireplace. Go. Get out of here. Doing a thing. Hi, welcome to So Awkward. I'm Don, and today we're going to do something a little different. I'm going to read to you from John Russo's novel, Return of the Living Dead. A little backstory, I guess, is required. Everybody has heard of the 1968 film, Night of the Living Dead, directed by George Romero, written by George Romero and John Russo. Big hit. Iconic film, one of the greatest, if not the greatest, horror film ever made. Created the modern day depiction of zombies, without a doubt. After that film was released and went on to great acclaim, critically and commercially, the two auteurs, as it were, I'm not an expert on the history, but they had some kind of disagreement on how to continue the series and how to do sequels. And they decided to part ways. And George Romero went on to do the Of the Dead films, and John Russo, the co-author, had the right to do Living Dead films. And he began with his novel, Return of the Living Dead, which is a sequel to Night of the Living Dead. It was later turned into a film directed by Roy O'Bannon called Return of the Living Dead, which I believe is very different than the novel. I am a zombie movie fanatic, and I have tried to find this novel for years, decades maybe even. And I finally found one, and I bought it from England. I paid $20 for it, which is pretty good. With shipping, maybe a little bit more. And it finally came, and I'm excited to read it. I don't think it'll be very good. I love Return of the Living Dead, but from what I know about it, it's very different. Return of the Living Dead is a comedy. I think this is more serious. But today, if you'll indulge me, I'm just going to read the first chapter of Return of the Living Dead by John Russo. And I'm inviting you all to listen to me. Let's check it out. It should be interesting. If I'm not too drunk. Return of the Living Dead, John Russo, copyright 1978. Return of the Living Dead opens with a prologue. Think of all the people who have lived and died and will never again see the trees or the grass or the sun. It all seems so brief, so worth nothing. To live for a short while and then die. It all seems to add up to so very little. Why do we fight so hard to stay alive, to preserve life, to hang on to that fleeting flicker of something which nobody has been able to define? It is easy to envy the dead ones. They are beyond living and beyond dying. They are lucky to be dead, to be done with dying and to not have to fear the inevitable, to not have to struggle for life that is threatened, to be under the ground, oblivious, to be oblivious of hurting, oblivious of the fear of dying. They do not have to live anymore, or feel pain, or accomplish anything, or wonder what to do next, or wonder what it is going to be like to have to go through dying. Why does life seem so ugly and beautiful and sad and important while you are living it, and so trivial when it is over? The fire of life smolders a while and then is extinguished, and the graves wait patiently to be filled. The end of all life is death, and the new life sings happily in the breeze, and neither knows nor cares anything about the old life, and then it in turn also dies. Life is a constant, endless creation of graves. Things live and then die, and sometimes they live well and sometimes poorly, but they always die. And death is the common denominator of all things living, the one thing that sends all things to oblivion. What is it that makes people afraid of dying? Not pain, not always. Death can be instantaneous and almost painless. Death itself is an end to pain. Death can be like falling asleep. Then why are people afraid to die? And which of us, once dead, would wish to forsake the peace of death to return to life again? Chapter 1. Dawn is a time of rebirth. All life senses this, the rising again to face new beginnings. Our story begins at dawn, or should we say our story begins again. Orange light fired the morning, accenting the colors of a green wooded landscape. A pickup truck shuddered through the woods, raising a cloud of dust as it bounced over the ruts in the dusty road between the trees. The people in the truck were in a hurry to get somewhere, and they were late. Bert Miller, an angry-looking man wearing an old-fashioned suit that looked new because it was worn so seldom, rendered to the business of keeping his truck under control, a task he performed with a combination of anger and skill. Anger that caused him to drive too fast and would make an accident seem inevitable, and skill that prevented that accident from happening. Bert was about 40 years old, with the weathered face and calloused hands of a farmer. He had a shock of straight black hair that refused to stay down, no matter how it had been wetted and patted and combed, although Bert did not wet and comb it too often. A farmer is what he was, and he wanted to be nothing else. Even if his farm was not a rich one, and he had to work excessively hard every day of his life to scratch out a meager living for himself and his 3 daughters. His wife was dead. She had died giving birth to the youngest daughter, Karen, who was pregnant herself and was sitting with Bert on the seat of that pickup truck. Karen was very tense and scared, clutching her armrest, hoping her father would not see her being frightened and use it as an excuse to yell at her while he continued to drive as fast as possible, negotiating tight, twisting curves and sharp upgrades by what seemed to Karen to be a combination of luck and bullheadedness. In the back of the truck, bouncing and sliding, were Karen's 2 sisters, Anne and Sue Ellen. They were more scared than Karen, and had reason to be. Their seat in the back of the careening truck was a low wooded bench on which they had to sit to keep their dresses clean. Sitting in the bed of the truck would doubtless have been safer, for the bench was unanchored and bounced and vibrated terribly with each lurch of the truck. They had known what sort of ride they were in for, and were not at all surprised by it, considering how angry their father was that morning after the argument at home. It was Karen's fault that they were late. In her 8th month of pregnancy, she had gotten up that morning complaining of nausea and weakness. That had been enough to set Bert to yelling. He accused Karen of faking morning sickness to get out of doing her Christian duty with the rest of the family, and had gone on shouting that it wasn't enough she had to disgrace him by giving birth to a child without being married, but she also didn't have any respect for anybody dead or living, and had lost her religion, and it was enough to cause her poor dead mother to turn over in her grave. Bert had insisted Karen get dressed and come along with the rest of the family, ignoring her protests that she was sick. But, in deference to her pregnancy, he had made her climb into the front seat of the truck while his 2 other daughters sat in the back. So far, so good. Then, because they were going to be late and because Bert needed very little provocation to bring his anger over Karen's illegitimate pregnancy burst into the circus. Bert had gunned the truck out, grinding gears and spewing gravel, and they had lurched toward their destination. "It's going to be our funeral if he doesn't slow down," Sue Ellen said, as she and Anne hung to the sides of the bench as if it would offer them any stability and protection during the bone-shaking ride. Anne did not reply. Even though the noise of the truck on the dirt and gravel road was deafening, she was afraid her father would hear them talking. "He can't hear us from up there," Sue Ellen said, reading her sister's thoughts, but Anne still said nothing. The dirt road straightened out a bit and became smooth over a stretch of about half a mile that was relatively safe to take at high speed, as long as there wasn't any oncoming traffic. But at least the wooden bench stopped bouncing and the two girls relaxed ever so slightly. There was only one more set of curves and another straightaway, where they would come up on the Dorsey farmhouse. Bert Miller gunned the truck a little, braking it for the curves, scaring his daughters, and slowed when he got into the straightaway and saw it lined, as expected, with all the cars and trucks of the farmers who lived in the valley. Some people had been able to park in a field near the side of the Dorsey house, and when the field had filled up, the rest had just squeezed their vehicles over to one side, as far as the narrow dirt road as possible. Bert Miller did the same, slamming his pickup truck to a halt and getting out and banging the door shut without so much as a glance over his shoulder at any of his daughters. He would have treated them that way even if he had not been angry. He expected them to fend for themselves. Anne and Sue Ellen climbed down from the bed of the truck, being careful not to soil their clean print dresses, and came around to help Karen get down from the cab. Bert Miller had already advanced 20 or 30 paces toward the Dorsey farmhouse. Nobody was standing on the porch, and he assumed that meant the services were in progress. Bert pulled at the knot of his tie and made an attempt to flatten the stubborn cowlick with the palm of his hand as he continued walking. Karen stepped tentatively and awkwardly off the running board, helped by her two sisters, then straightened up and tugged her maternity blouse over her belly. She felt embarrassed and undignified, and was aware that all the people inside the Dorsey house would know she was pregnant without being married. "I didn't want to come," she said. "They're all going to gossip." "You're going to have to face it sooner or later," Anne said. "If not now, after the babies—" She cut herself off, having seen their father staring at them angrily, waiting for them to come along. He was on the porch, having halted there so they could enter together as a family. As they approached the house, the girls heard people crying inside. Bert Miller opened the screen door and entered, with his daughter behind them. The living room was jammed with people, some filling all the sofas and chairs, the rest standing. The coffin was against a wall on the far side of the room, resting on what looked like a low table, or some sawhorses and boards, which had been draped with a white sheet and then surmounted with flowers. In the coffin was the body of a child, a 9-year-old girl, the younger Dorsey daughter. She had died of rheumatic fever. There was a stirring among the congregation as the Miller family entered the room, a self-conscious stirring, because a prayer had been about to begin, and nobody knew whether to interrupt the prayer to greet the latecomers. Also, there was the sight of Karen's obvious pregnancy. Over by the coffin, Reverend Michaels continued to thumb through his prayer book, seemingly... Are you done? Can I continue? Not a fan. Over by the coffin, Reverend Michaels continued to thumb through his prayer book. Can I read? Can I read the book? Over by the coffin, Reverend Michaels continued to thumb through his prayer book, seemingly unaware of any interruption. The parents of the seemingly unaware of any interruption. The parents of the dead child were standing next to the Reverend, staring into the small coffin with faces full of helpless, dumb-stricken grief. Having found the appropriate prayer, Reverend Michaels turned toward his congregation and saw that Bert Miller and his 3 daughters had arrived. "Please be seated or stand quietly," the Reverend admonished them. "The service is about to begin." He stared at Brett Miller, letting the man know that the tardiness was not noticed. Then allowing his disapproving eyes to fasten... I'm doing a thing here! There's probably like 3 people watching this. Mr. and Mrs. Dorsey continued to stare at the coffin all the while, not sure how to act or what to say, and almost beyond caring about the formalities of the service in their anguish over the death of their young daughter. "I ask each and all of you to join me in prayer." I did a different voice. I forgot the voice. Reverend Michael said, and after a short pause he began the funeral prayer that each member of the congregation was expected to know by heart. "May the soul rest in peace. May the soul leave her body. May the body remain. May the body turn to dust as the Lord has spoken. May the body never rise again. Release the soul unto heaven, and all else turn to dust." During the prayer, several of the mourners readjusted their seating to make room for Karen, while her father and sister remained standing in the rear of the room. The prayer finished, Reverend Michaels closed his prayer book. The congregation remained very still and silent, not shuffling and stirring as often happens at the conclusion of group prayer. There was no sound in the room except for quiet weeping. Reverend Michaels looked toward the rear of the room, as if expecting something for which he did not have to ask. The service was clearly not over. The parents of the dead child, the mother sobbing quietly, the father silently showing the strain of his grief in his eyes, continued to stand arm in arm by the open casket. The grief and sadness in the room was suddenly accompanied by an undercurrent of tension. The Reverend continued to look to the back of the room. Pairs of eyes, previously focused on the face of the distraught parents, began to turn in the direction of the door. After a few moments, the mother, too, stopped sobbing and looked up, joined her husband's gaze as he looked over the heads of the congregants. Now, all weeping had ceased, and no one seemed to be breathing. All was still, as if the dozens of eyes were willing something to happen. A man in the far corner of the room stood up, and all the eyes stared at what held in his hands. The man was tall, lean, and wearing a worn brown suit. He walked across the rear of the room and came down a path cleared for him by the mourners. All eyes stared at the large wooden mallet he carried. He walked slowly through the room, looking hard at the father of the dead child. He approached the coffin and gave the mallet to Mr. Dorsey. At the same time, placing his left hand sympathetically on the grieved father's shoulder, Reverend Michaels produced in his right hand a large metal spike, similar to the kind that are used in the construction of railroads. The Reverend handed the spike to Mr. Dorsey. The faces of the assembled mourners were tense and expectant as they all looked in the direction of the coffin. There was no sound now, but a few shuffling footsteps. The dim light in the room seemed to accentuate that silence. As most of the congregation watched, Mr. Dorsey placed the spiked to his dead child's forehead, and then, with the reverberating sound of wood against metal, the father pounded the spike deep into the skull of his daughter. Tears streamed down the man's stolid, silent face. Mr. Dorsey screamed. Mrs. Dorsey screamed, unable to control herself, and continued to sob in anguish in the arms of several of the women who rushed forward to comfort her. Suddenly, the screen door burst open and slammed against the farmhouse wall with a crash. A small boy stood in the doorway, excited and out of breath, his eyes on Reverend Michaels as the symbol of authority. "It fell!" he cried. "The bus! It rolled over and over! I was right there! I went right over the hill! Everybody! All of them dead, I think!" Everyone in the congregation began shouting questions at once. A man in the back of the room near the door began shaking the boy to get more information out of him. "Where did it happen? When?" he demanded. At the crossroads, a few minutes ago. The bus wrecked and fell," the boy repeated, trying to catch his breath. Reverend Michaels became stern. He shouted for the attention of his congregation. They faced him, waiting for his instructions. They needed the authority of his voice, though they all could have predicted what he would say. If there were dead people on the bus, and if some would die later as a result of injuries, the spikes needed to be driven into their skulls to ensure that the peace of death would be final and complete as the Lord had intended. "You all know what needs to be done," Reverend Michaels intoned solemnly. "But we must hurry. There is not much time." The congregation began to move, people scrambling, hurrying out of the room. Several men had bags of spikes and mallets which had become symbols of death and were often brought to funerals. Others always carried these items with them in their cars. Bert Miller turned to face his daughters. Anne, terribly frightened, had buried her face in her hands. She backed against the wall as her father moved toward her. "I don't want to go," she yelled desperately, cringing from her father. Bert seized Anne by the wrist and shook her to bring her face up so he could stare into her eyes. "You're going, and so's Sue Ellen. The only one who ain't going is Karen, because she's pregnant. She can stay here and wait for us all to get back." The rest of the people had already piled out of the room as Anne and Sue Ellen were shoved out ahead of their father. Karen watched, scared and shaking. End of Chapter 1 of Return of the Living Dead by John Russo. What did you think of that? Yeah. That's Chapter 1 of Return of the Living Dead by John Russo. I'll read another chapter again if anybody comments on this video. And if I don't hear from John Russo's lawyers with a cease and desist order. I imagine it's out of print. I imagine he's lost the rights to it. I don't know. I'm not trying to, get any money off this. I'm literally interested in the story. I've been fascinated by the concept of this novel, which I've never read. It's the first time I've read the first chapter. Obviously, if you've seen Return of the Living Dead, the film, it's very different, which is a madcap comedy. It's also very scary. It's one of my favorite zombie films. Possibly my favorite zombie film. So yeah, if you want me to read more of this book, it's not that long. Comment down below if you're John Russo's lawyer and you want me to stop. Comment down below. I'm dog sitting right now, so I can't guarantee that the next chapter I read will have this beautiful fireplace. But you never know. Yeah, thanks for watching, everybody, and hope you're having a great night. The dead have risen again, and now the horror is worse than ever before. A bus turns over in a quiet American town, and soon the entire country is filled with the terror of the undead and their insatiable lust for a human flesh. No one is safe from these inhuman creatures, and it seems like all will die, or become one of them, in the nightmare of blood and horror that is the return of the living dead. By John A. Russo.